Stop it. I'm so disconcerted, guys. I'm getting ready to turn this video on, and my cat is drinking out of my cup of water, and she's still doing it. She must feel like, you know how kids start to act out when they're in public because they know that their parents are going to be a little bit different and, you know, not react the way that they would in private. I don't know, most parents, at least me. Hey, Sheila! Thanks for coming. Daisy, my cat, is drinking water from my glass. She's never done that before, but she can feel that I'm like tied up and I can't get to her. So anyhow, so the book that I'm using is the same book, is the same book that I've been going through, and it's America's Women, 400 Years of Dolls, Drudges, Helpmates, and Heroines. And it's such an amazing book by Gail Collins. And, and so I am just kind of going through chapters. I started towards the beginning, but I may jump around and do a few and, you know, see what you all are interested in. But for now, for today, we're going to be talking about the Gilded Age. And I'm always really terrible with like the dates and history and stuff. So I wrote it down. I was like, when was the Gilded Age? It was between 1870 to 1900. And the name is actually really fitting. It was named by Mark Twain in I think like 87 or 79, something like that. Because it was an age of, you know, gilded is like everything is like sparkling and covered in gold. And that's what the Gilded Age was. It was a time when the American economy grew faster than it ever had in history. And people were getting rich left and right. And it was a time of industrial progress where there were these huge companies being formed, businesses and corporations that were able to really grow and help their employees to make tons of money. So there was like a new class of super wealthy people. We had mass production happening. We had innovations in technology, and we had innovations in society. So, of course, we're going to be focusing on how all of that plays into women and how they sort of rode that wave. And they rode it pretty well. So let's just make sure that I covered all of the basics before we go on. Oh, it was also a time where philanthropy was really big. So a lot of people like Carnegie, all of these really big, super wealthy people were contributing money to hospitals and to schools, you know, that's why they have like buildings all over the place named after them. It was sort of a gospel of giving, I think is what they called it. So they were opening up a lot more opportunities for other people that were outside of their social sphere to elevate themselves. And so it's funny because the Gilded Age is actually really the only time in American history, according to the book, that's where I'm getting most of my references from and scattering in some other knowledge that I've learned along the way. It was a time when plumpness, like plump or larger women, was what America wanted. And it's funny because it's phrased almost like really parallel to the times. It was a time of more is better. And so when it came to women, the same idea was there. And so the women that we saw were dreadfully, like terrified of getting thin. And that was really a reaction to the time before the Civil War. And I know, Sheila, you were here the last time as well. We were talking about women and their body image and what was considered beautiful. And pre-Civil War, what was considered beautiful was to be an absolute like fairy nymph, as thin as possible, as delicate and frail looking as possible. And yeah, and it was linked to being sick, but they saw it as a good thing, you know, so tuberculosis and consumption made women very frail, very thin, very pale, very sickly, but it was considered I think I'm back. It's a video pause. But that was considered the ideal of beauty. And so this was sort of like a backlash from that. And so women were encouraged to eat, to get nice and plump. And that's what the people wanted to see. It was also the first time in history that we had a woman first lady who wasn't like matronly and, you know, Martha Washington looking. So it was a time when like the celebrity culture started to rise as well. I don't think that they could have ever imagined the celebrity culture that we have now. But it was definitely a time where people started taking notice that, you know, some people are so elegant, so fancy, so beautiful, and let's like admire them. So there was a really big rise in magazines, and with the rise in magazines, we see an increase in looking for topics to write about, and women was one of those topics. So we had, what was her name? She flew all the way around the world. She did that 80 days. Shoot, I'll remember it in a minute. But, so let's talk a little bit about the women. Okay, so here we have the chorus girls. And the ideal chorus girl was considered to have really large thighs and big calves, but they still wore these super tight corsets around their waist so that, you know, the top was like spilling over and the bottom was pouring out and the waist was really narrow. So we see that there was still some restriction in that, you know, it wasn't just go all out, but it was still looking for this particular form in women. But we see a lot more freedom for women to not really like be killing themselves over being thin and meeting this really difficult ideal. Photography was also becoming very popular. It was becoming a lot more common where like the normal woman who could afford it would want her pictures taken. And so they started getting, you know, tints in pictures. So women would request that their cheeks get rosier and rosier and that their hair gets brighter. And so that's why if you look back at a lot of pictures of the time, you'll see that they have those weird like rosy cheeks on a black and white photograph because they wanted to look like healthy and vibrant, and they knew in real life that that's what looked nice. And so they would ask their photographers to do it more and more and more, and it became really dramatic. But what I found interesting was that at the time, makeup was still considered something that like fast women or loose women wore, right? Could you imagine if somebody came now? I mean, I think most women put on something before they leave the house. I don't know. I think that's a fair statement, right? At least a little mascara, some lip gloss or lipstick or blush or something like that. But it was considered, you know, like very classless. But the women who really started introducing makeup to the masses and making it acceptable is surprisingly not the lower class women. At least surprising to me. I would feel like the lower class women had less to lose and they would be like, you know what, whatever. But it was like the jet set women. It was the women who had the money and who had the fame. They said, screw it, I'm gonna wear makeup because this looks cool. And they started making it a bit more popular. But popular opinion was still on the side of going without makeup for women. And so that was like a really slow thing for women to kind of get into at that time. Another key fashion, I remember my grandfather telling me that serious women didn't wear makeup. Yes, I definitely heard that as well, like growing up. Not so much with makeup, although I did hear it with makeup, but like with not wearing stockings. Did you get that you had to wear stockings as well? I'm like laughing. They were like, you are not going out without stockings on your legs. But even now when I wear makeup, yeah. You know what? That would be a really good survey to have. Like, among women, what was the thing that you were told? Because I don't know if it could be like based on culture or, age group, but what was the thing that you were told growing up that like serious women or respectable women didn't do? So you can get your nails done, like they shouldn't be too long, or was it like they shouldn't be red? Because I know like red is like, oh God, no, it's gonna get everyone's emotions all riled up. So we had stockings, we had nails, we've got makeup is a no. What else have I heard? I also was told that having bangs, was like a sign of a loose woman as well at some point. Like, it's too much. But that would be really interesting. I would love to know that. Another fashion trend that took off in those times because it was such a period of like excess and abundance was the feathers, like wearing like having these really big ornate hats, which are really beautiful. But very detrimental for a reason. So your grandfather said there were things, those were things from the devil. Catholic girls shouldn't call for attention. Hey, Pat, how are you? Catholic girls shouldn't call for attention. Yeah, I think that that's sort of a common theme. And when we were talking about, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable for women to be wearing or how they present themselves is don't call attention to yourself, right? If it's like calling attention to yourself, then in a sense, you're like being a floozy. Hey. So, hi everyone for joining. Hi. So yeah, don't call attention to yourself. And so what's really nice about this period of time is that it was becoming more acceptable for women to call attention to themselves, to say, hey, like I want to look more attractive and I'm going to admit to that fact. And sometimes it was like the bigger the show, the better. Like everyone wanted to be entertained, whether you were, walking down the street or looking through a magazine, whatever it was, people were trying to put on a show. I always think of like The Great Gatsby, and it's like all these parties and champagne popping. And I think everyone likes a little bit of attention for sure. I mean, who wants to be ignored? So yeah, and so that was a time when women were kind of stepping out a bit. There were some things going on socially that also encouraged women to step out into the world. And one of those things was shopping. Women at that time started becoming the primary shoppers of the family. Before that, the man would go out and he would buy what was needed, or they would send the maid or whoever to go out, and he would have really the control of the finances. And that's not to say that the men still didn't have the control. Bye, Nick. It didn't mean that men didn't still have control, but women were leaving the house more and going shopping, and that was a really big thing. Before that, I learned something super interesting, and it was that women, I knew that they didn't have the freedom that men had in the public sphere, but even at nice restaurants did not serve women. Women were at home and men would go to restaurants. Women were at home while men would go to the theater, would go to the movie theaters to watch a film. It was not considered respectable for women to be out in public spheres with men. And so with the Gilded Age, this is when we see that it starts to become a bit more acceptable, that women are starting to come out of the house. They're starting to have some financial power and decision making in the house. And because of that, society... Thank you, Sheila. I don't know what's going on. His mom seems like a very lovely woman from what I can tell. but I don't know. So yes, women start stepping out of the house, and because they start stepping out of the house and spending money, businesses take notice because, you know, money talks. So a lot of the theaters, what they started doing was coming up with ways to encourage women to come out. So they would say, hey, if you come on over to the theater, we'll give you like a free bag of flour, and just other things, like domestic things that they thought that women would like, to encourage them to come out. And they started saying, you know, instead of having all of these like rowdy young men and prostitutes coming into our theater, which was like predominantly who went to the movies, they started encouraging families to come out. And so the Gilded Age was the time when families started spending time together outside of the house. Before that, if a woman wanted to go out for a nice dinner, she would get all dressed up and they would go to a friend's house for dinner. They would not go to a restaurant. That to me was like, are you kidding me? But such a different time. So because women started having more power and more freedom, we see that something else happened for them. One of the really big revolutionary changes for women socially was the creation of the department store in America. Department stores were like the place to be, and it was so different from what women were used to for a few reasons. One, the prices were fixed. You come in there and the prices are right there and you choose what you want. There was less pressure to buy, so you didn't feel like, oh my gosh, if I walk into this place and then, you know, if I'm not purchasing anything, that they're going to kick me out or they're going to pressure me to buy. Women could actually just go there, and it became like a promenade. And the aisles were large and expansive, and they would go and they would meet up with their friends. And it was sort of a place to kind of get together and meet. And also the quality was more, what is the word? I think sometimes I'm a better writer than speaker. There's this great show. Oh, the Selfridge. Yes. I always see like one season of something and then I don't see it again. But yeah, Selfridges, when he was starting the department store, which I think was in England, or was it in America? I don't remember now. But it was really big for women. The book was talking about how they had lavish restrooms, and in the restrooms you could rest and have refreshments. And it was sort of like the first time that women were expected to stay out of their house long enough that they would need to use the restroom somewhere else. It was like before that you're running here or there and you're coming right back home. So it was a good excuse for women to start branching out and getting out of the house. What was also really great about the department store, and he calls it a very American idea, which was the department store was very democratic. In other words, if you had money to buy, you were just as good as anyone else there. So you could leave behind your social class, your social standing. It was actually the owner of, which store was that? It starts with an S. Oh, Marshall Field. Doesn't start with an S. I don't know anything. Marshall Field, he instructed his clerks to refer to all of the women in his store as ladies, no matter how they were dressed, no matter what social class they had, no matter what their manners were. And by manners, we don't mean whether they were polite or impolite, but we know that the social classes had different manners, that the wealthy had manners that were like their own set of manners, you know, that unless you were like in it, you didn't really know what it was. And so you could often tell a person's social standing by their manners and the way that they carried themselves. So he said, everyone is equal, and whether they have money or not, it's no pressure, let them come. And so women started going out on the town and just looking at the window displays of all of the various stores and starting to separate themselves and get out of the house a bit more. Hey, Mark. Thanks for coming. So that was a really big change for women. It also opened up the job of being a clerk a store clerk, which was a difficult job. Oftentimes they would work extremely long hours. I think in like the holiday seasons, they could work up to 16 hours a day. And of course, because they're women, usually, thank you, usually their pay was really low because, you know, when you want cheap labor, you find the women, right? And then you say, oh, we'll give you a job now. It's okay for you to get out of the house now. But shop girls were typically single. 6 hours in heels. Oh, forget about it. I have like one pair of heels which I feel like I could wear for 16 hours and be okay. Otherwise, I would have been like day one, like, you know what? Yeah. But you know what? Actually, let me say this. The alternative was factory work. Or was being like a tutor, some sort of educator or something like that, which oftentimes, you know, it could be really grueling, some of the factory work. We have lots of horrific stories of what it was like in the factories. This was when mass production, hey girl, this was when mass production started really taking off, and so they would just cram people into factories. Around this time, we had a really big influx of immigrants coming into the country as well. And so, you know, that was the job that they could get. And so they would stuff these people into the factories, and they knew that people needed work. And so they would pay them very little. So being a clerk in a department store was sort of a step up. You know, you get to be indoors and you get to check out what people are wearing. And so, yeah, the pay wasn't so great. But it was a way to move up the ladder a little bit more. And so one of the things that you would find in these department stores, as I was saying earlier, were these huge, elaborate hats. So if you see fashion from the Gilded Age, the women had hats that just got bigger and bigger and bigger. It was all about the show. And so they would wear things like feathers in their hair. Sometimes they would wear full birds, like they would wear finches, they would wear pheasants, which I don't know that I've ever seen a pheasant in real life, but I feel like it's pretty big to be wearing on your head. And it got to a point that they were killing so many wild birds for the sake of this fashion trend that it actually created the very first environmental protest in America. Hi! Thanks for coming. So the fashion of the time, wearing these huge elaborate hats that were covered in ostrich and finch and red robins and pheasants, all of these different birds, caused a public outrage. People started to say that this is just entirely too much. As a matter of fact, I was watching a documentary on the Everglades recently. I live in Florida, and so it's, I don't know, it's kind of close to my heart a little bit. And they were talking about how many, hey, Untitled, they were talking about how many birds, some went extinct, some were on the brink of extinction because of this fashion trend. And the birds and the feathers weren't just on the hats. Oftentimes they would also like trail them along the, oh, it's okay, I appreciate you coming, thanks. They would trail these birds along like the hems of their clothes, their dresses. They would have like finches like trailing behind them on the ground as they walked. I mean, it was really a time of excess. Women would curl their hair with like hot rods. I don't know how they had any hair left, but they would do these really elaborate like updos and curls in their hair. And then for special occasions, they would sprinkle their hair with silver or gold dust. Like, how pretty is that? I don't know how you would wash it out. I don't know how long they kept these hairstyles in for. But it was really a time of evolution for women. Another thing that women started doing to sort of build on the freedom that we have now is they started having like women's clubs. And they would have like these women's book clubs where they would come together and they would have intellectual conversations and they would read and discuss. And of course, just as any time women are sort of stepping out of the house and doing something besides, you didn't you didn't wash it too much, your hair. And we're going to talk about like the whole bathing situation in just a minute. So actually I should know the answer to that question. But yeah, so they started, anytime women were kind of stepping out just a little bit more, there would be some sort of public backlash, like we're losing our women. And so when it came to having these meetings, these committees and such, there was all kinds of outlash. So one person was quoted as saying, "Homes will be ruined, children neglected, woman is straying from her sphere." And some people call them clubbers, because like that sounds like they're like, but they're just sitting around talking about books and stuff. But this is how, difficult it can be. Some people called it an unspeakable menace, that women were being lured from their duties as homemakers. But thankfully, with time, we've been able to keep pushing and keep pushing. So I think it's just really great to know what things were like so that we can appreciate the fact that we've continued to push and that, it's not for nothing. Like some women were out there really wrestling with some nonsense for us to be able to just go out and do our thing and live our life now as we can. So women started working also in offices. And so this brand new thing called the typewriter came out, and it was like taken like right away. Like women have smaller, more nimble fingers, so typewriting is for women. And so, whereas before, most of the jobs of like being a clerk, like in an office setting, was reserved for men because it was viewed as something that required like a certain amount of intelligence, and you're going to be surrounded by other men because that's who was in business, right? Men. So, woman stays home and the men go into work. So because there was such a boom in the economy, there were so many businesses that were being established, they needed a bigger workforce. And so they found that a proper place for women to be, a good job for her to have, was to be a clerk. And so we see also this sort of Victorian sort of workplace sexual harassment where men would start requesting secretaries and clerks to work for them. And one of the women who owned such an establishment, like a staffing agency, she said that they would phrase their requests for female secretaries in the most peculiar language. They would ask for things such as a pretty blonde, and that she had to make clear that secretaries were offering professional services instead of companionship in business offices. So, the men were kind of getting a little bit excited. They were like, oh, wow, now we get to have a woman around. And they were just kind of taking it not as, a serious profession. And it was actually a woman who suggested that we start typing with more than like 2 fingers at a time. And then people were like, what? That's insane. Why would they're like the best clerk typists type like with only 2 fingers? Like, oh, that's a good thing. And she's like, I think it'll be better if we use like multiple fingers. So everyone who's like typing now, you're welcome. For her, I still type with 2 fingers for the most part. I paid absolutely no attention in my class. The teacher we had to like, I don't know how you guys did with your typing, but the teacher had the computer and then she would put like a manila folder over our hands and say like type without looking, and then she would go sit at her desk and not pay any attention to anyone. So like I was just like this the whole time. Well, joke's on me, because now my friends are like, and I'm like, hold on, I can't do it. But everyone was suggesting that, like a typewriter is the best Christmas present that you could give to a girl, because if she learns to type, then it's like the world is open to her as far as like employment goes. At this period of time, though, it was still considered the norm that as soon as you got married, you were out of it. You were out of the workforce, and you know, hopefully your husband could support you. The majority of white women, I think only 3%, 3% of white married women worked. And among African American women, it was acceptable. It was much more acceptable for a married woman to have a job. Of course, you know, her situation and the situation of African Americans at that time was a lot tougher, right, to get ahead. And so it was a luxury that they could not afford. And I read somewhere that in the Gilded Age that racism was the worst that it had been since the Civil War. And I don't know exactly what the reason for that was. Maybe because it was just so close and so fresh, and it was after Reconstruction, so there were a lot of bitter feelings and such. But anyway, that was the case. So women were getting into the workforce, and they were starting to spend money, and people were starting to take notice. And so, you know, women kind of got a higher standing in society. It would be a shame for your husband if you worked. It meant he was unable to support you. It was still a reality up to 30, 40 years ago. I mean, I know in America it was still a reality. I'm wondering about other places in the world. Was it acceptable? Is it acceptable for your wife to be working, or is it considered a shame, like an embarrassment, you know? If a society insists that the woman's place is at home and your wife is outside of the home, then you've failed in your role. Like, you failed to live up to that. And I think that it's really interesting, you know, it's like when you restrict one person, you know, it's like when one person suffers, everyone suffers. Because imagine the husband who is telling his wife that she can't work. Maybe she wants to work. Maybe she's really passionate about something and she wants to do it. Because, I mean, to be honest, I think many of us, if we had the choice, would probably still work. We would work at something that we love, not something that we hate, like a factory. But, you know, he's telling her, no, you can't work. You can't do this, no matter even if you want to. But at the same time, it puts a lot more pressure on him as well, because now he has to live up to this standard. And if the family is suffering, the family is suffering, because society and himself have agreed that the woman's place is at home. So for African Americans, it was a bit different. For white women, it wasn't acceptable for the most part. Women, of course, who had no choice, who were widowed, who were abandoned by their husbands, or who were just extremely poor, they did work. So, you know, there were women who were like, I got to go out there and get a job. But, you know, there was a stigma attached to it, that your family life isn't as strong, that you're not as capable as a man. Many people even thought that women working would like drain them of their femininity somehow, their feminine traits, their feminine qualities, that they would become more masculine and man-like, which is insane to think about, because the amount of work that women did at home was tremendous. In the time before the Civil War, they had these stoves come out, and it was supposed to be like so helpful to women. The stoves, just cleaning the stove every day, took about an hour of your day. They were still doing laundry by hand, and the laundry, you had like this thing of soap, and you had to shave it, and then you had to boil it, and so you had to start the fire to boil it, and then you had to be scrubbing all the laundry and hanging it up to dry. There was a lot of work going on for women in the domestic sphere. So women were used to hard work, right? But again, you know, people pick and choose what it is that they think is important, or the story that they want to tell. Water was one of those things that was really difficult. We were talking before about showers, that the women would have these really intricate hairstyles, and they would put like gold or silver dust in their hair for special occasions. And Sheila was like, they didn't wash their hair very often. And they didn't even like wash very often. And of course, it's all relative. But at that time, most people still didn't have running water in their houses. Here, during this time, we saw a lot more people moving into cities. America was becoming much more industrialized, so people were leaving the small rural areas and moving into tenement houses, and tenement houses were a mess. Tiny little spaces, broken up. You know, when you take a house and you break it, you chop it up and you rent out the separate rooms. They were doing this with buildings that had once belonged to people prior. They were making them smaller and smaller and smaller. And so oftentimes families would be sharing one room. There would be one bathroom on the floor, or sometimes in the building if you got a really bad one. And so everyone on the floor would have to share the restroom. The water plumbing was still very rudimentary. So when families did get water, oftentimes it only traveled so far as to their kitchen, and the water would fill up in like a little pan, and that's all the water that they would get. Or they had to, and a lot of buildings didn't have plumbing, especially if it was built before plumbing was created and it was a cheap place to live. Women oftentimes had to walk down many flights of stairs to go pump water from a well, and then come back up the stairs with the water and use that for everything. So obviously the use of water was very limited. You know, people weren't just bathing from head to toe on a daily basis and using water the way that we do now. So it sort of went from, you know, you just take a wet towel and rub yourself down. And then they had like the water basins, and women would stand on, I think it was called like an oil pad or like an oil wax pad or something like that. Maybe I can look it up, but for the sake of continuity, I won't right now. So they would just stand, you know, in one spot, and they would have their bucket or whatever, and they would pour water on themselves. Hi, thanks for joining. And they would wash very simply. So when it was the wealthy class that started to use water more and more. They were the ones who started getting nicer plumbing. And then it was like, okay, water doesn't just go to your kitchen. You can actually get water to go to other parts of your house as well. And then Sears came out with something that was like a boiler that allowed you to heat up the water. And once the water started getting heated, then people were like, this is kind of nice. Because, I mean, imagine in the wintertime, even if you had water, you were probably like, forget this, I ain't taking a shower. It's like ice cold. You just pumped it from a well and walked up with it. So after some time, you know, the wealthy started introducing like better plumbing, and they started getting more water. And then when the first bathtubs came out, a lot of people said it was like a waste. They had a nickname of being the zinc coffin. I guess they thought people were gonna drown in the bathtub. I don't know what it was, but they basically thought it was just like this frivolous luxury. And now, of course, every home has a bathtub, every home has running water. But it took quite a bit for women to take care of household responsibilities. But young women could go out and they could get themselves a job as a typist or as a store clerk, and they can go out into the factories. And now they were going out to movie theaters, they were walking around department stores, just like chilling, you know, just like having a good time and meeting people. So, you know, the dating scene was more poppin' around those days. So it was a time of a lot of fun, and people were starting to relax socially. It was a really big shift in how women were perceived outside of the home. Oh, there were some women who did some really cool things to kind of push women past, you know, just like these very delicate things that can't really do much. And one of them was Nellie Bly. I don't know if any of you have seen Drunk History. It's a show on Comedy Central? Anyway, it's called Drunk History, and it's awesome. So if you haven't watched it, go do that. But they have an episode on Nellie Bly. She was a reporter for the New York World. And so in the Gilded Age, it's like sensational journalism is when it started like popping off. Before I'm like, boring stuff. So the more outrageous, outspoken a woman was, it wasn't necessarily viewed as like a bad thing. It was like, oh, she's got our attention. What's she doing now? So Nellie Bly was a journalist, and she was one of the leading people that sort of got into the genre. I don't know if it's a genre. Got into the field of like investigative journalism. So Nellie, one of the things that she's really known for is going undercover in an insane asylum. She pretended to be insane and got herself thrown into, what was it, Blackwell Island? Gosh, I wish I could be better at remembering like specific details, but I think it was Blackwell Island. If anyone knows, let me know. And she wanted to show the terrible treatment that the mentally ill, particularly the women, because that's where she was, were being treated there. And I forget how much time she spent, but she would like smuggle out like little notes and things saying like what's going on and the treatment and what they're doing to people and force feedings and all of this like really horrific treatment. And for a woman to be to put herself in a position like that and to be writing these really groundbreaking pieces of journalism and making moves to really change the culture and change society was pretty cool. Hi! I'm so happy you're all here. So yeah, Nellie Bly was super bad. She posed as a homeless woman. She basically was trying to figure out what were the jails, what were the hospitals really like for the people who didn't really have a voice. And she was also one of the people, this is what I was trying to say before, when Jules Verne, he had written, how many days around the world? 80 days around the world. She decided, because she was just like the coolest woman ever, she was like, you know what? I'm going to actually do it. Like, forget about 80 days around the world being a book. So everyone was like, what? Because a man hadn't even done it. This was like a book that was really popular. And so she went country hopping, and she caught like a boat, then she like rode this, and then she rode a train, and she came back in, I think it was 78 days. She like actually made it under the time frame. So she was a super cool chick, and it was, I don't want to say that it was the Gilded Age that allowed her to do that, but all of the really big changes in the culture, what the values were, the values being like this really sensational, like living a big life, having like this outrageousness, this opulence, everything is like extra and extra showy, and having a spectacle, the sense of like fun and excitement, all of that was really a great time for her to like step into who she was and take advantage of that society and then push it even further. So she was really cool. I don't know if you guys have heard of her. There was also another thing that women were doing, which was like switchboard operation. Switchboards came out, and actually the first like cross-country phone call was made by a woman, and Edison was like, yeah, you go ahead and do it. And so they found that men were often talking back to people on the phone when they tried to make them switchboard operators, that they were just like not having it and they were too grumpy. So they're like, oh, we need people who are willing to be like polite and courteous and get paid less. Like, let's have women do that. And yes, they were getting paid way less than men as clerks, as typists, as switchboard operators, but they were still taking steps and putting women into the workforce in a way that wasn't necessarily seen before. Women were going into the workforce now with the idea that when they got married, they would leave, yes, but it wasn't like, I don't belong here because I'm a woman. It became, I don't belong here just because I'm a married woman. And we see this cycle kind of happening throughout history, where new fields open up to women little by little, and then the next, stream comes along, and then new fields open up to women as well. Last week we were talking about how women were trying to get into, women were not predominantly, a lot of women were midwives. And then as men became doctors and they made it a profession where you had to go to a university to study for it, they started kicking women out of that field. And so being a midwife, that career path for women started to shrink. But we see that women are still taking steps to like keep pushing back, to keep making progress in life. So I thought that was really awesome. Let's see if there's just anything else that I am forgetting, because I don't want this to end and be like, oh no, I didn't even mention this. Let's see. I think that's all. Last time and you guys tell, girl power. Last time when I ended the video, because I can't see the time on this thing, it ended up being an hour, and I didn't know. I was like, is that too much time, or is that like a good amount of time? So then I was like, maybe I should have less info in this one and like break it up. So I just got here. Can you do I'll do a quick summary. I love to talk. Okay, so you know what? Actually, that's a really good idea for all of them that I do. I should always do a quick summary at the end. So thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. Okay, so the Gilded Age, it was around, I would say like 1860, but it's also said from like 1870 to 1900s. It was after the Civil War. It was like after Reconstruction, and it had like the fastest growth in the American economy, like in history. So all of a sudden we have all of these big booming businesses, and we have these industrial giants. We've got steel coming out. We've got mass production. Hey, Rika. We have mass production. And so there was just a lot of money to be had. And at that time also, they had something called, it was like, what was it called? It was like the spirit of generosity. Like philanthropy really started taking off. Before then, like, just think Scrooge and A Christmas Carol. It was sort of like every man for himself, and that's very, American, that ideal. Like lift yourself up, and everyone's the land of opportunity, and go out and seek your opportunity. But here it became like a cultural thing to be a philanthropist. So we have all of these really big magnets, these powerful men and families that are opening up and contributing to schools, universities, and hospitals. They're opening up libraries in their names. And so we have like this really rich like culture that's building in America. And at the same time that we have this really rich culture being built up, we've just got tons and tons of money being poured into the economy. And so these people are establishing really big businesses, and they're giving their employees opportunities to make a lot of money. So we see a lot of super wealthy people coming into the culture, whereas we look at like England and stuff, and it's, the people way up here and then everyone else is down here. So we were seeing a lot more opportunities for people to rise up, and they really took that. It was called the Gilded Age. That term was coined by Mark Twain, and gilded, because everything was just sparkling and new, and let's make it as big as we can make it. Let's make it as like grand and opulent as we can make it. And so that was like the value of the time, and that was the feeling of the time. And so when it came to women, there were a lot of huge changes for women. We started leaving the house more. And so we find that whereas beforehand, women weren't allowed in nice restaurants, like ever up until this period of time in American history, nice restaurants, theaters, any type of place that you would go for like entertainment and such. I mean, even like opera houses and things, a lot of it was like the sphere of men. And so if a woman wanted to go out to dinner with her husband, they would go to another friend's house. They weren't going out into the public and engaging with other couples that way. It just wasn't the thing to do for women. So men sort of had the rule of the world outside of the home, and so at this time, women started stepping out more. Department stores became a thing in America. Women started having more control of the finances, and advertisers were like, let's jump on this. And so all kinds of advertisements were geared towards women. Even like ads for men's clothing was geared towards like the wife, like get your husband this. So they were embracing that women had the power. Of course, they probably just felt like, oh, we could manipulate them better. But women were really using that as an opportunity to like really free themselves from being stuck in the house. So department stores made it really great because they treated everyone equally. It's like, so long as you had money, you were welcome inside, as opposed to, oh, you look like a street rat, you get out. And so women were able to like really mix and mingle, and shopping and department stores became like a favorite pastime. You would walk like the huge aisles and you would see people that and the restrooms had like refreshments and they were really like elegant and nice. And so women were going out. When theaters saw that, oh wow, women are like spending money and they have some control or influence over the household, they started to like cater to women and to invite women to come. Before that, it was like young boys and prostitutes were going to movie theaters, and now it was like, come on in, women. And they made the adjustment from being something that was sort of like a rowdy hangout spot for the young and reckless to a place where you can go with your family. So in the Gilded Age is when we see this new sort of thing of like family time and like, let's go out as a family and spend time together. Because usually when the husband wanted to go have a good time, he would leave his family at home and he would go have a good time with the boys. So now the women and the children are like, we're coming along too. So that was really great. There were some jobs that opened up for women. The jobs were typing, that the typewriter had like just come out, and so they felt like women would be really good at it because our fingers are small and nimble. And so women got a great opportunity to get new jobs that were outside of the factories, which were grueling, terrible, hot, crowded. The pay was extremely low. Typists still got paid way less. I think it was like less than 50% of what the men were making. They were able to start working in department stores and be like clerk girls, which was also a step up for them, where they could, move up a little bit in their salary. They could have like a better environment where they could see what was going on. And they also started working more as secretaries as well. And I was saying before that, of course, they started working as secretaries and all the men just saw it as like, oh, we get to have a pretty face in the office. And women had to be like, no, like I'm a professional, I've like learned my typing skills and I know how to, I don't know exactly what they do, but it requires brains. And there were people saying at the time that this was a mistake because women didn't have the intelligence to do the work, to do clerical work, and that they were taking the jobs away from men. And women had to prove that no, like we know what we're doing and we're actually really great at it. They were also working as switchboard operators. Most women were still expected to leave the house, to leave the workforce when they got married. And that went on for, a really long time in America up until very recently. But we do see that there was more influence that women were having in society. As far as like fashion and beauty goes, women were, the plumper the better. And it was like the one time in American history where that was just like totally the thing. I feel like the 50s I feel like there was like a more voluptuous look then as well. But this was like, women were afraid of getting thin. and when I say, I'm making a generalization, but for the most part, women did not want to be thin. That was considered, you know, how women previously felt about getting bigger in the pre-Civil War times. Pre-Civil War, they all wanted to look like they had tuberculosis. They wanted to look really frail, delicate, pale, faint. That was the look. And they wore very stiff clothing, and everything was very restrictive. Here, they wanted them to be like very, very voluptuous, and women would eat and eat and eat to gain weight because that was seen as the standard of beauty, which just goes to show that we should be accepting our particular body type, you know, no matter what century, because it's also arbitrary. And then fashion-wise, women were wearing very elaborate clothing, specifically their hats. They would wear huge, huge hats. They're really beautiful, and some of them are just sad because there's just dead animals all over their clothing. The very first environmental protests in America happened because women had taken the fashion so far that some species of wild birds were going extinct, and some of them were extremely endangered. The Everglades in Florida was one of the places where they sort of swooped in, and all of these bird killers would come in, and they would catch these native birds for the sake of their feathers, and they would pluck them, and the bird went to the trash, and it started to cause a national outrage. But before then, you know, it was like it started off one way and then it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And women would attach whole birds and finches to the bottoms of their dresses, and they would have whole birds on their hats, and, you know, with the tail like trailing down. Everything was about like the spectacle, the show. So that was the primary synopsis. Life was still really tough. There was a huge surge of immigrants still coming into the country, and most people were moving out of rural settings and moving into industrial lives. And industrial life brought really cramped tenement housing. It brought poor sanitation. There wasn't excellent, like the plumbing wasn't really good. It was still really difficult to get water. Most people were pumping from wells or just getting a little bit. So, you know, like the whole bathing thing was, you know, kept to a minimum still. And then after that, we also see it's when people, like, we start forming the suburbs in America as well. And I didn't get into that part just because I want to, you know, keep everyone's time. I know everyone has things to do, but the suburbs started coming into popularity when people started getting like sick of the tenements, which were like, can you please like back away from me? You know, it's like everybody was like this. I don't even imagine how there, like, more fights probably didn't break out. It's probably a fight every day. So that's like the synopsis of The Gilded Age. It was huge for women socially, really big leaps as far as, I mean, just being able to get out of the house without it being seen as something wrong. Like, you're a loose woman. What are you doing out here? Oh, and makeup. Makeup was still viewed as like something that fast women did, and the wealthy women are who brought makeup to the masses. They were like, you know what? I know you're saying like only fast women wear makeup, but I'm gonna do it because it looks good. And photography also started becoming much more common in the world as well, and so we start having our first portraits. And yeah, it was just a time of real abundance and women taking really big leaps forward in the world. That's my summary. I hope I didn't miss anything. I feel like I was speaking a mile a minute, but I think that that's it. If there's any particular like period of time that you want to hear about next time, and I can give you a rundown of it, let me know in the comments. And I don't know, does anyone else have anything that they want to add? Any thoughts? Anything that you found surprising, interesting, horrifying, or anything like that? I'll just wait a little couple seconds. Oh, and very last thing, actually, for those of you who didn't catch, this was the book. Oh, I'm almost out of time. America's Women, 400 Years of Dolls, Drudges, Helpmates and Heroines by Gail Collins. It's a really awesome book. It's got so much insight. Oh, thank you so much. The 20s, we're gonna do it. Thanks everyone for coming. Bye.